my pleasure to be here with you today. So, over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about operator growth strategy. So, how different operators around the world are. Yeah. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'll be talking about how operators around the world are trying to grow revenues, in particular how they're trying to grow revenues beyond just connectivity. And I'll also be talking a little bit about what's happening in Malaysia and compare what the Malaysian operators are doing to what some of the international operators are doing. Now, it's quite a small group, so if you have questions, please fire them as we go through if there are things you want to clarify or dig deeper on. So to start with, just a bit of a framework for where we see growth. So we think essentially 4 different types of growth. Now clearly one, connectivity is the big part of the business today, 90+% for most operators. And we're still seeing operators, even in the mature, saturated market, still concentrating on connectivity, still trying to get revenues from connectivity, still trying to grow those revenues. It's not a case that they're just seeing connectivity as essentially managed decline, they're still trying to grow those revenues. So talk a bit about that. The second is around extensions to the core. So operators seeing what services they can sell to bundle with that connectivity, essentially as complements to that connectivity. The third area is the new opportunities. So these build on what telecoms operators have, their existing strengths, but their new areas, security or health and so on. And then the final area is what we call venture capital investment, so investing early stage startup companies. Now this is something we see much less of today, but there are still some operators doing it, and I'll give some examples of that. First though, just to talk a bit about operator revenue and operator revenue growth. Now, apologies, this is a little bit small on this chart.
Yeah, can I pull my chair?
Sure, yeah, please. And if you want to come closer at the back, okay. Yeah, don't be shy, please come forward. So as you can see, this is the revenues on the y-axis. So going from some of the massive US operators, the AT&Ts, Verizons, and so on, to some of the smaller operators, and this is year-on-year growth for 2016 over 2015. The point, as we said at the top of the chart, it's a very scattered spread. Some operators are seeing growth. So AT&T, that's largely through acquisition. They bought DirecTV, a pay TV provider. Deutsche Telekom, again, that's in the US, really that's about T-Mobile US. But some of the other operators like Orange, which its revenues had been declining for a number of years and has stabilised. Turkcell, Turkish operator, relatively small, but seeing very good growth. Now, I don't have the Malaysian operators on here. Well, they're a mix. I mean, we see here there's a spread between these international operators, and the Malaysian operators really mirror that spread. So Telekom Malaysia grew about 3% last year, so it's about here, kind of the A of Etisalat. Maxis was pretty much flat last year, about $2 billion in revenue, so it's about the end of Telecom. And Celcom didn't have a bad year, sort of -10%. So obviously at the bottom end of this chart. But the sort of spread that we see in Malaysia is kind of typical of what we're seeing around the world. Some operators seeing a bit of growth, 1 or 2 exceptions, mostly sort of around this clustered area here.
Is it mainly because of the merger and acquisition for the AT&T?
Is it me?
Because of for AT&T, what was the...
So AT&T is about acquisition. So this includes inorganic revenues as well as organic revenues. So AT&T bought DirecTV, a satellite pay TV provider, and that caused a big jump in its revenues. So yeah, that's the exception there. Turkcell it's a challenger operator in quite a competitive market. It's done very well, so that's why it's grown its revenues. And Deutsche Telekom, as I say, that's all about T-Mobile in the US doing very well.
So for the initial, what we see with AT&T for this year, is it going to be normalized back to earlier?
So yes, it will normalise, but it also sort of depends on acquisition as well, because obviously it's trying to buy Time Warner. Now if that goes through, I guess it won't hit its financial accounts this year, but next year there will be another big spike of growth.
Where does money come from?
Where does the money come from? It is. So in the US you have 4 mobile operators, but it's dominated by the 2, AT&T and Verizon. And if you look at the things like the EBITDA margins of them, they are very high relative to international benchmarks. So the EBITDA margins are above 40%, close on 50% for some of the operators. So they generate a lot of cash. Now it's changing because the US market is becoming more competitive. T-Mobile in particular doing well. That's bringing prices down to being more aggressive. But historically, I mean, and you can also see their scale. They're $100 billion plus businesses that don't have massive margins, and so they throw out a lot of cash. And the question really for these two is, what do they do with all of that money? And now what they've done, or what AT&T's done, is through acquisition. The same to a lesser extent with Verizon. Any other questions? Am I keep on going?
So, for example, if you go back to your previous slide, they are going to that box, the extension to the core.
So, I'll come back. They're doing they're doing basically these 3. Verizon's doing quite a lot in the VC funding as well. So, actually, for most of these operators, and this is part of what I'm saying, if you look at the Malaysian operators, they're basically doing this. If you look at the other operators around the world, all of the other companies here, they're doing at least 1 and 2, often 3, and in some cases 4.
So that's the secret to their success, being able to have that revenue to be able to spend on that.
Yeah, so I mean they're using essentially you've got a cash cow in a connectivity business, but once the market saturates, you're all competing, increasing on price, revenues flatten, maybe don't go down a bit, and so you need new impetus for growth. And where does that come from? So increasingly we're seeing operators looking at these different boxes for that growth. That's not to say they're ignoring connectivity, which is worth coming back to again and again. Even AT&T, where revenues per subscriber are very high, margins are fairly high. It's pretty expensive to have a mobile in the US. So even there, they still think there's some growth in connectivity, but they're looking at these other areas as well.
So those, can you go back to the
Sure.
So those companies on this negative growth
Yeah.
are only in the connectivity business?
It depends. It's very hard to.
Maybe you can illustrate, for example, Telefonica, why is it there?
So, Telefonica, this is where it gets quite difficult, because for like a Telefonica, partly it's currency, so a lot of their businesses are in Latin America, and they've done against the dollar, they've done pretty badly. Also, the Spanish economy has been very poor, so something 30-40% of its revenues come from Spain, and it's done very badly in Spain. It's starting to get better, but it's had a tough old time. Singtel's a really interesting one in that in Singapore it's been very competitive, and in Australia it's been very competitive, but it is moving into some different areas.
So it might be a result of going to different verticals.
So, as I said, 90% of their revenues come from connectivity. So the picture here is largely driven by what happens with connectivity. So if they're declining, it's basically because their connectivity business is growing, declining or growing. In the case of Deutsche Telekom, AT&T, it's a bit different.
So when you're talking, say for example, Singtel or Telefonica, you're not talking about just the Spanish or the Singaporean. It's actually the global presence.
The whole business.
Yeah.
But they probably wouldn't say this, but I think realistically speaking, they're hoping for the connectivity business to be flat. If it's flat, that's probably good. Maybe there's 1% growth, maybe there's 2% growth. But longer term, they would like it to be flat. And this is just a 1-year picture, and sometimes you get strange things happening in 1 year. So longer term, they would like it to be sort of flat, 1%. But they also want to grow. Now, it's one thing stabilising the connectivity business, maybe getting 1% year of growth, 2%, but they really want to be getting 5% year-on-year growth. So they're looking beyond just the
Which
connectivity.
is good for companies that are negative growth.
Sorry?
Negative.
Yeah.
Negative as compared to the previous year.
1 year.
No, they're negative, but they're making.
Yeah, they're still making, they're still, for the most part, they're still very profitable businesses, and this is why I think be slightly careful about what we say, because Verizon's declining, but it's declining from a very high level. If you look at spend per capita on telecoms in the US, it's very high. Now, you can sort of justify it and do like a PPP and say, well, Americans are rich and so they spend more on telecoms. That's kind of normal. But you can also argue their revenues can still fall quite a lot, and they're still very profitable businesses. So you have to be slightly careful, because this is just a one-year picture, and actually the underlying position of some of these operators is very different. So, I don't say taking it Teatalk, maybe it's got a little bit of growth, but probably Verizon in a strong position. Does that make sense? So just to go through these 4 points again pretty quickly. So first thing about connectivity. So how do they get connectivity growth? Obviously, if you get more subscribers, that's going to grow your revenues. If you're able to increase revenues or revenue per unit faster than or increase usage faster than prices fall, so moving people up to tiers, maybe different tiers, different amounts of data, fixed mobile convergence, quite a lot of that here as well, and also connectivity for things, IoT. So not talking about the services part of IoT, the hardware or the applications, just for connectivity. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about connectivity growth. In terms of proximate services, so we're talking about things like TV, so you bundle TV with your broadband package.
I know I'm lagging a bit, but can I ask
Sure.
you a question on the last slide? So here, when we look at, for example, the last two bullets,
Yeah.
so you're talking about license or unlicensed band. Where is it going to?
So
For example, number 4 in effect.
clearly for IoT, it's going in both directions. You've got Laura, like I think you're here in Rizal. Antilles, is that the? Yeah. And they've got a LoRa network, a licensed spectrum. Increasingly, you're seeing narrowband IoT networks being built out. So in China, the 3 operators, Vodafone. My feeling is longer term we'll see more connections on licensed spectrum than unlicensed spectrum. But right now it's fairly evenly matched. It's probably more unlicensed than it is unlicensed. I mean, I think the interesting thing about having unlicensed and licensed is that you've got this price competition, that you've got new types of competitors who are going to really push the prices down for IoT connectivity. So in terms of overall spend, overall revenues are from IoT, we're fairly pessimistic. Our view is that by 2025 globally, IoT will account for about 3% of revenue, connectivity revenue. So it's still lots of devices, but the revenue per device is very small. If you're connecting a street light or a meter, they're generating tiny, tiny amounts of traffic. Plus you've got unlicensed competing against the licensed spectrum, and that's bringing revenues down. So pricing pressure. Okay. So the next one is, as I say, what we call proximate services. So things that you sell alongside the main service. So it could be bundling TV with the broadband. It could be having some sort of financial services that go to mobile subscribers. It could even be smart home. Now, most operators haven't done a particularly good job at smart home, but if you look at Comcast in the US, it's got more than 1 million subscribers to its smart home solution. And there again, it's bundling it with its fixed broadband, with its cable broadband proposition. So they're not necessarily moving into these new areas to generate strong revenues. It's going to have an impact on margins, but it helps solidify that core connectivity revenue. So it's decreasing churn, and there may be some synergies by offering multiple services, and obviously extending the position in that chain. So that's the second one, moving into proximate services.
In terms of a holistic picture, churn is still the same over the years, or do you see something happening? Is it increasing? Or is it never changing?
It's very hard to give an overall picture. I think it varies country to country depending on competitive dynamics. Over time, though, it has gradually come down. Yeah, I think it's fair to say globally.
What kind of financial services offered by Orange?
So I'll come to Orange a bit later, but they did some experimenting in Poland with some services, but more recently they bought a bank in France, which they're going to launch as Orange Bank. So they made a big investment. It's quite an interesting move, because they've sort of played around the edges of financial services and it didn't really work. So now they're going.
They're playing mobile money or mobile banking?
It's banking. It's a full service bank. So you could have your current account with it. You could get a loan from it. It's not just a payment solution, but it's a full services bank. And I think that's their. I think that's their learning from what they've done in other markets, that just doing a mobile wallet, the sort of things that could M-Pesa in Kenya gives always an example, but that's clearly an exception that hasn't really been replicated.
For example, in Poland, where they're playing at the less regulatory hurdles, is that why they've been able to go in that direction?
I think I don't know the details in exactly what they did in Poland, but I think it was more somebody else had the banking license, and they were just doing like a sort of collaboration, kind of a whole, like what we call an MVNO, but for a bank. The bank holds the license, and then they just offer a service.
They didn't actually buy over the bank.
They haven't bought over the bank, but I think they've decided to compete in France. They have to buy a bank. You just can't play around the edges. You either do it or you don't do it. It's kind of binary.
Any banks buying telco?
They do it all.
Any banks buying telcos?
Convergence.
Basically, the other way around, anything that buys. Or give us any examples where other verticals buy telcos.
AIS, or the Thailand.
Yes.
Right, okay, you have an example I could.
Thai bank buys.
Right.
Yes.
AIS is the operator, right?
Yes, it's a bank.
It's a bank.
For AS Bank, there's an AS Bank.
AIS bank.
Yeah.
So they do it all together.
So they're both an operator in a bank.
Right.
Which
They know which one first.
So we've seen it in the other way around. So Pakistan, Telenor's subsidiary there had a 49% stake in a bank, and it's since bought a majority stake. So there are other examples of what Orange is doing.
they don't know Grameen, so they some micro and
Right. Some interesting things. This third one is the operator going into new areas, not as proximate services, but trying to go into new areas as revenue generators in their own right. So advertising, quite a few examples. So close to here, Singtel has clearly done a lot around advertising with Amobi and a bunch of acquisitions on the back of it. Verizon as well bought Yahoo, it's bought AOL largely for their advertising businesses. IoT, so this is not the connectivity part of the IoT, but operators trying to provide a full service, so services and hardware and applications and so on, and moving down the value chain. Security, again, Trustwave, Singtel, very good example of operators going into security, but lots of other operators doing it as well, in the US and in Europe. Healthcare, Telstra in Australia, very good example of an operator going full on into healthcare, providing IT services, and more just general IT support services.
So telcos, are they hedging their bets, or are they actually putting on one horse?
What I think is interesting is that if you roll back 5 years or 10 years, you had lots of, like Telefonica Digital is probably the canonical example of this. They formed, they had, I think it was 8 different areas or 10 different areas, and they were investing relatively small amounts of money in each one. In each project maybe had $10 million of investment or $20 million of investment. investment, but it was spread across a lot of different things, and none of them really worked. What we're seeing now is operators go into 1 or 2 or maybe 3 areas and make a very big investment in that area, but not invest elsewhere. So it's much more focused. So Orange Bank, I think, is an example of that. They're spending a lot of money building a bank in France. The same if you look at what Singtel's doing as well. Singtel's picked off advertising as an interesting area, and it's bought Turn, it's bought Amobi, it's bought like 2 or 3 other companies. It's spent more than $1 billion on acquisitions around advertising.
Amobi is mobile banking.
Amobi is advertising technology.
What about business analytics? Because Telco has a lot of data.
So
They analyze the data, they
Yeah.
sell along the business intelligence.
Or does it
We
feed
them under advertising.
a bit. We don't really see operators going into analytics in a big way, trying to sell services to others. They are using it internally to try and understand their customers better and reduce churn and whatever. So we're seeing a bit of it. I've seen some projects from Orange and Telefonica, some of the US operators, where they're trying to sell their data to other parties. But to be frank, they're fairly small projects. So there was one I saw in so Telefonica in Spain, in Valencia, a city in Spain. There's a festival every year. So they tracked how far people travelled to go to this festival and how long they stayed. So it saw that people who lived in the next town came for the afternoon. People who lived far across Spain, they came and stayed for 2 nights. I mean, it's like, okay, people who go travel a long way stay a few days longer. It's not that surprising. But also, it's a consulting project. It's a consulting project for the city of Valencia. It's sort of one-off. It's not easy to see how you scale that. And I think that's the problem that they've got right now. Yes, they can see all of this data and how they use it internally, but how they scale it into a business, they're not really sure. Okay, so this is the third. This is them going into a new area, into a new business, and trying to make it stand up on its own right. And then finally, this venture capital fund. So this is closer to what I was saying was happening 5 years ago. More as a scattergun approach. You invest in lots of different things and see what works. We don't see so much of it now. There are some examples. So Telefonica is still very heavily involved. Verizon has lots of VC investments, and some others like Orange, to a lesser extent, are still making some VC investments. So there is still some of this happening, but it's more data is being called into question. It's harder to see this working.
Well, what was the original rationale for going
Can we go one round first?
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Sure. So, sorry, this is a bit small to see, but these are the operators here. Green means they're doing it, and it's a major strategic focus. Orange means they're doing some of it. It's an activity, but it's not a big one. And white means they're not doing it. So you can see on the left-hand side, this is connectivity. So all operators are doing connectivity. They're investing in connectivity. It's their core business, and they're still trying to grow it. That's the same, I think, for the operators here in Malaysia. To a lesser extent, you've got video content. Now, most operators are doing something in video content. I talked about AT&T buying DirecTV and Time Warner. That's an exceptional case, but so it's doing more than everybody else. But all of these other operators are doing something in it. Enterprise IoT. Most operators doing something in enterprise IoT, and then less and less as you get further over to the right. So healthcare, a couple of operators involved in healthcare, a few in advertising. We talked about analytics. Some operators doing it, as I say, mostly for internal use cases, but certainly looking at doing it as a business. E-commerce, I think SK Telecom is the only one that's really invested in e-commerce. Really, the core of the focus is around this, which essentially, that's connectivity. That's the first one we talked about. Video and content, that's a sort of extension, proximate service. And then these get more and sort of further and further away from the core business.
Green and orange is what?
So green is they're doing it and it's a strategic focus. Orange is they're doing something in it, but it's not a big focus. So they've got some initiatives. So Vodafone, it's doing some stuff in TV. Yep, that's true. Yeah. Verizon maybe. Yeah.
Because the population in America is 300 million.
Yeah.
So if you have China and India, you can figure out what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think in India, I suspect they're all pretty negative for 2016. There's been Reliance Jio, the new entrants.
But still they are
Still they're making revenues, but it's, yeah. Given the number of operators, there's something like 11 operators in India, because they have different, so it's going to consolidate and it's going to come down.
Yeah.
But they've had Jio, which is new entrant, being very aggressive. In China, you just have the 3 operators. It's much more stable in terms of competitive situation. No, I think they're. I'd have to check. They're below Verizon. I'm not sure exactly what their revenues are for China Mobile.
For example, India, Telenor is exiting India. So
Yeah.
what's the story?
Because they have too many operators. But in China, because in China itself they have billions of people, so kind of make a big money.
Yeah, they do have billions of people, but the revenues per subscriber are obviously very low relative to, say, the US. I'll have to check that out and find out. It's expensive, but also usage is very high in the US. So if you look at the average smartphone in the US is using something like 4 gigabytes of data a month, which when you think of that, that's on top of fixed broadband. Because I think here in Malaysia, the average smartphone usage is a similar figure, but in fixed broadband penetration is much lower. Whether in the US, you've got very high fixed line usage and very high mobile usage. Okay, so go on. So just as a very quick summary, and I'll go into some more detail in a minute. Operators trying to extend their business by going into proximate services, things like video. They're looking at new opportunity investments like security, like advertising, healthcare. Malaysian operators, when we look at them compared to that, look very much focused on the network and connectivity. So I'll go through just to look very briefly at the Malaysian operators. Now, I'm no expert on the Malaysian market. You understand it much better than I do. But from my very brief look at what the operators are doing, it's mostly focused on this area. It's mostly focused on connectivity. So if we look at Telecom Malaysia, as I said, it's growing a small amount, 3% last year. And fairly consistently across the business, so it's growing mass market, it's growing its enterprise business, it's growing wholesale business, it's all around 3%, a bit under for managed accounts, a bit over for mass market. But the focus seems to be very much on that first part, on the connectivity, particularly around convergence now that WeBe is up and running. So this I took from their annual report in terms of their strategic priorities. So there are some things here which is reprioritising productivity, which I think just means cutting costs, delivering convergence, more of a mobile arm, and going digital. Now, in terms of new areas of growth, going digital sounds like the interesting one, so kind of digging down on that. Customer experience, big focus for all operators, not so interesting here. Process optimization, so about cutting costs, and then new opportunities. So that feels like it's about growing revenues, but within that, there's these 5 different smarter areas, smarter living, businesses, cities, communities, and nation. But at least from what I can see, and you probably know this better than me, but I can't see much in terms of activity under each of these. At least from the public statements, there's not very much. Doesn't seem to be much happening yet. So interesting that those are the focus, but it's very different from some of the international operators who've invested billions into the smartphone or smart nation and whatever. Then I looked at Maxis briefly. So Maxis, very flat revenues, nothing much going on. Subscribers slightly down, ARPU slightly up, pretty flat. Again, from looking at the annual report, a few things on their priorities: new enterprise capabilities, full digitization, scale up fibre, investing in quite a cost efficiency. So some things there, and there's some detail about what they're doing in enterprise, but really it seems fairly limited, fairly basic. So things like FlexiShare, which is a way of enterprises sharing their data plan, more about connectivity, not especially exciting. They've got M-Drive, so a vehicle tracking solution, again, particularly innovative. For IoT, mostly it seems to be coming from Vodafone, so they're going to resell Vodafone solutions. So a little bit going on with Maxis, but not that much. So some sort of aspirations here about new enterprise services, but at least from what I can see, not much detail behind it. And a very similar picture with Celcom. Did much worse in terms of revenues, big decline in revenues last year, mostly due to a decline in subscriber numbers. Focus this year on network, so they've committed $315 million to upgrading the network. Some talk at least about new areas, things like enterprise and IoT, but again, not much detail behind it, that they are involved in this LoRa network. So the picture that I get, at least from the Malaysian operator, seems to be it's very much focusing on things like customer experience, improving the network, but not so much on these new areas and on new ways of growing revenues. So LoRa is a low-power, unlicensed network for IoT devices. So it's for connecting very simple devices like a smart meter or a street light, where you don't need much throughput, you don't need much capability. So there's something going on there, but overall it looks pretty limited.
You're referring to Celcom or Axiata?
This is Celcom.
Those number of operating countries?
Oh yeah, so that's Axiata, sorry. Yeah. And some of these initiatives, I think from like IoT, there are some group initiatives around payments, some group initiatives. But yeah, sorry, the numbers here are, except for that one, it's all Celcom. Now, as I say, most of the operators, the other, they're bigger international operators, are doing at least 3 of these 4. So if we start with Telstra, I think it's a really interesting example because at a top level, Telstra's revenues are flat. Nothing much going on. They went from 26 billion Australian dollars to I think it's 27 billion dollars in 2 years. Really not very much, but that's masking the change that's underlying their business. As I said before, when I was talking about Singtel, very competitive local market in Australia for mobile revenues falling very quickly, and that is what we can see really in Telstra's revenues from the core services. So it's gone from 20.5 billion to 19 billion. But they've been investing in other areas. A big part of this is international. So they have a joint venture in China. They also have PACnet for Asia. So part of it is international connectivity. Also their IT services business in Australia, they've been investing in quite heavily. They've made a couple of acquisitions last year, sort of cloud IT service providers, a couple the year before. And so overall they've done a really good job because they've kept their revenues flat, even though the fundamentals, the core business is in decline. Now, they've moved into these new areas and that's having an impact on margins, so these EBITDA margins falling slightly, they keep on falling. But overall they've actually quite aggressively moved the business by moving into some of these different areas. So this is talk about their strategic pillars. So customer experience, as you would expect, driving value and growth from the core, the usual stuff, and then growing these businesses close to the core. So this is partly the healthcare business. So in healthcare, they've made something like 13 different acquisitions, 13 separate acquisitions in healthcare. Most of them are fairly small companies, but it's a very big area of focus. In fact, if you go to Telstra's website, they say they have 4 businesses. They have consumer business, they have the enterprise business, they have wholesale, and they have healthcare. So it's in a sense, healthcare is one of their 4 priorities, and that's much more emphasis than any other operator around the world puts on healthcare. Now, in terms of revenues right now, healthcare revenues, they don't report them, they're part of a different line, it's still very small. I think it's proving quite difficult for them to integrate those different businesses. But I also think they realise if they're going to do it, it's clearly a long-term play. It's not something you earn revenues in a year or 2 years. It takes 5 years or 10 years. First, them investing in the core, and then the other areas around IT services. So this, again, from one of their recent presentations, talks about the different solutions that they've got, either through investments. So they bought some of these companies, the acquisitions, and others they're partnering with, but it gives them a range of solutions: security, cloud services, applications, and so on. So quite a big portfolio of services, and that's why this is one of the reasons why they've been able to stabilise their revenues, even though revenues from connectivity are in quite a sharp decline.
Do they have this mandatory kind of thing that they have to do their service inclusivity? Not exclusive, but inclusive. That means every nook and corner you have to cover. Is there such thing in Australia?
Yeah, they have a universal service obligation.
Okay, but
Yeah.
that's only under universal. But it's like here, right? Under a fund which is used by the regulator, right?
Yeah, so there's I don't know exactly how it works in Australia, but there's a fund that goes into paying for universal service. So regardless of where you are in Australia, you get connectivity. Okay, let's slightly aware of time, so just to move on. Vodafone, just very briefly. So again, it's looking at communications. It's kind of the core part of their business. So their aim is to become the world's largest provider of communication services to enterprises, with hosting and security particular focuses for that. But also they're looking at these new digital businesses. So enterprise IoT they've had since 2007, and this is the bit that Maxis is essentially reselling now. They're also data analytics, we talked about a little bit. They launched that a couple of years ago. Haven't really heard that much from it yet, but one area they're looking into. And then finally this consumer IoT business, it's a new area for them. It's going to launch at some point this year, they say. They've got 100 people working on it. I think launching with some fairly basic products like kid trackers and pet trackers and some smart home solutions. But interesting to see such a focus on consumer IoT. Not many operators are doing that. And also they're investing in their network. They made an announcement the other week about investing in fibre in Germany. So they're still doing this investment in connectivity and 4G and so on, but they're trying to build some things on top of it, particularly around enterprise, particularly around IoT, hosting and security, big focus areas. Orange, slightly different, much more emphasis on home services, I guess as being the French incumbent, largest share there, providing fixed and mobile services, and in most of their territories they're doing fixed and mobile, so Spain fixed and mobile as well. But they're trying to move into some of these different areas, financial services, energy and smart home, and a slightly different focus in the Middle East where they're more of a mobile operator. But just to talk about some of these services, so this is what they did in Poland. They launched mBank back in 2014. It's still relatively small. So Poland, the population of Poland is what, 40 million. Just to give you some idea, they've got 345,000 subscribers to their bank service. So it's still pretty small. It's still a pretty small bank. I mean, they were the number 3 in net adds in 2016. So they're not doing too badly. But I think they realised that the way they were going about it in Poland through a partnership wasn't really enough to really move the needle and to really gain them share in banking. So what we've seen them do in France, as I say, they bought an existing bank with an existing banking license, existing customers. They're going to relaunch it. It says first half of 2017 has actually been delayed. They're still not launching it. They're having some problems in what they're doing, but it'll launch at some point this year. But it's going to be a full bank account. So credit cards, savings accounts, everything you'd expect from a normal bank. They have this slightly awkward thing called a phygital strategy. So it's a mixture of physical. So they have the stores. So in every high street in France, you have an Orange store, and obviously they have the online presence and mobile apps and so on. And they're trying to combine those for the banking experience. And then their target pretty aggressive. So 2 million subscribers. What they're aiming for. They don't have word data when buying. They've also played around some other things. So again, in Poland, they played around with some energy, but it's not really worked. 15,000 subscribers by the end of September 2016, so pretty small. Also, smart home, they've dabbled around in smart home, but 8,000 smart home kits as well. As I say, the story is still pretty small. So their focus very much seems to be on this banking initiative in France. And I think this reflects the general mood amongst operators. They've gone from trying to do lots and lots of different things to now investing in 2 or 3 things, investing heavily, which is what we're seeing with Orange in France. So Singtel, I've talked about Singtel a bit already. I'll go through this fairly quickly. 2015, 2016, bit of decline in revenues, as we talked about on that earlier slide. But the interesting thing is again, it's the mix of revenues for Singtel has changed dramatically. So I call them here other revenues. That's basically their core business. That's gone, it's declined hugely. But they've been able to manage services and other enterprise have grown a bit. So partly that's these new services, things like Trustwave, but also their IT services, Mobi, and so on. So again, you've got this countervailing trends. One is the competition in the core business causing revenues to go, but they're trying to invest in new areas. Now, the interesting thing I think about Singtel is clearly it's in a fairly small, limited market. It's one thing if you're AT&T. If you're AT&T, you've got a huge population to go and sell other stuff to. If you're Singtel, Singapore's too small a market. So the things it's been doing, if you look at, so firstly in terms of Trustwave, it's not limiting itself to the Singaporean market. It's really a global proposition. So it bought Trustwave back in 2015, $770 million, so a significant acquisition. I think the largest acquisition that any telco's made in security, the biggest telco acquisition of a security firm. And it was a well-established company. It's 1,200 people, revenues of a couple of $100 million. So it wasn't buying a small startup. It was buying an established business with an established customer base. Now, at the time, most of Trustwave's business was in the US. I think more than 80% of their business was the US. So the opportunity from Singtel's perspective was to take that expertise and then to put it into different markets. Now, partly where it already has presence. Let's go to the next one. So partly they've done it where they've got presence. So obviously it's got a shareholding. It's a shareholder in Globe, so they've launched it there. But also in other countries. So they've launched in Japan, where they not through a subsidiary. It's also launched in Canada. Rogers in Canada, and it's launched in Singtel in Singapore, not just in Australia. But it's not limiting itself to where it's got footprint. This is kind of the important thing about Singtel. It's thinking beyond its footprint, because again, it's already the largest operator in Singapore. It's already got a big systems integrator in Singapore. It's kind of limit to what it can do in Singapore. It has to look beyond it, which is what it's doing in terms of security. I think I've sort of talked through all of that. But also in terms of advertising. So it's bought a Mobi back in 2012, 2013, quite a few years ago, and then since then it's made a number of bolt-on acquisitions. So it bought a Mobi back in 2012, it then bought Adcunyon, Contera, and then more recently it bought Turn. So overall it spent something like $1 billion on acquisition, which is second only to Verizon spent more because Verizon bought AOL and Yahoo. But it makes it the second. It's spent way more than everybody else except for Verizon on advertising technology. And again, it's bought established businesses that maybe had been around for a number of years before it was bought by Singtel. And most of its business was international, still is. So again, it's an international play by Singtel, not just constraining itself to the local market. And I think I've made those points. So just on to, I'll rattle through the next ones fairly quickly. So this is AT&T. This is AT&T's growth picture. Big jump here. That's DirecTV. That's why we saw the big jump in their revenues last year. Also in terms of in Mexico, so this light blue here, that jump there, that's media and entertainment. That's the DirecTV acquisition. And the purple that you can see growing here, that's the Mexico. They bought a couple of operators in Mexico and merged them. That's been the real driver of growth at AT&T. It doesn't talk much about IoT in its financial statements. It doesn't report its IoT revenues, but we think it's generating more than $1 billion in revenue from IoT. Most of that from connectivity. Makes it the largest operator in terms of IoT revenues in the world. It's bigger than Verizon. It's bigger than Vodafone. Around a mix of areas. What is obviously connectivity through its 4G network. More recently launched an LTE-M network. It's got a horizontal platform, so it has tools and. So LTE-M is it's if you've got LoRa at the bottom end, which is for connecting streetlights, for very simple. Then you've got a standard 4G at the top end, which is for connecting a smartphone. Then LTE sits in somewhere in the middle. So it goes up to a megabit per second. So it has reasonable bandwidth. You could stream video. You probably can stream video. You can stream audio on it. You can use it for voice just about. So it could be used for things like smartwatches in future, where LoRa is probably a bit basic, but you probably want something that has better battery life than a 4G network. So it has those connectivity capabilities. In terms of horizontal platforms, it's got a few things that it's developed internally. So ways, tools that developers can use to build IoT services. It has some vertical solutions, AT&T Drive for connecting car, and some end-to-end solutions. It's less of a focus for AT&T than it is for Verizon, but it does have some complete solutions. And just to support that, it's got a number of foundries around the US that are just focused on developing some IoT capabilities. Okay, I'll just go through a couple more. So Verizon and Telefonica. Verizon and Telefonica are different because they're doing all four. They're not just doing most of the operators are doing the three and then stopping there. These guys are doing this venture capital investment as well. So Verizon's stated growth is network leadership, like everybody else, investing in network for connectivity, doing some stuff around content, video content. Talked a bit about what it's doing advertising. IoT, also a big area of focus, made a number of acquisitions. Telligis, Fleetmatics, bought Hughes Telematics a few years ago. So it spent more than $3 billion just on this IoT fleet management space. But I think probably the interesting area, or the point I wanted to make here, was really about its venture portfolio. So this is from its website, and this only goes up to C. So it's already got 12 companies before you get to the letter D in the alphabet. So if ever you need an example of a type of company that has a telecoms operator as an investor, just go to Verizon's website. They've got everything. Just to give you a flavour, so for home, that's some sort of smart home thing. There's some advertising. That's an advertising. Those two are advertising technology companies. They've got investments in drone companies. They've got investments in like a whole range of different things. Probably more than 100 investments in total. So that's kind of the old school scattergun, invest lots of money into lots of different things and just hope some of them come good.
Have they switched off the 2G?
Sorry,
Have they switched off the 2G?
Verizon, I don't think it has yet, no. And then, so Telefonica, it's doing the other stuff. There's the phase 2, phase 3, so security, it's made a bunch of partnerships, acquisitions, it's got a very broad security portfolio. Of those different areas, cloud, fairly flat, security, fairly flat. It's only really the IoT that's driving revenue, so this is a percentage of their total revenue. That's, again, mostly around connectivity. But really the point I wanted to talk about in terms of Telefonica was their venture investments. And again, they've got this very much a scattergun approach to investments. They've invested in more than 400 companies and try and manage that portfolio. They've committed investment of $500 million. So again, much more than your average operator. But they're not necessarily trying to extract synergies from these companies. So it's only around a quarter of the companies are actually working with a Telefonica operating business, which I have to say surprises me, because what's the benefit of Telefonica? Apart from, well, it's got its money, but there's lots of VC funds that have money. You'd have thought that working with the brand would be part of the thing that Telefonica can offer, but it isn't really doing it. Has three types of investments. One is a Telefonica Ventures. It's less active than it used to be, but this is more a traditional venture fund. Some of them have a clear link with the core business. So Sigfox, another like LoRa, like low power network. But some of them, it's kind of you look at them and you struggle to work out what exactly the relationship is. So they've got the investment in Open Seneca, which is a way for citizens to talk to their government about problems. So if there's a pothole or something, you can use it. What that has to do with Telefonica, I have no idea. There is also an investment in Amerigo. It's a Latin American fund of funds. Again, quite a large investment. I think it's 300 million in total that they're committing to that. Not exactly clear what the logic is, but it may be more political than it is actually economic, because obviously they're a big player in Latin America and they want to curry favour with the people in power there. And then finally, the Wairo is a startup accelerator. So Telefonica is investing relatively small sums of money, $10,000, $20,000, that sort of thing, to get a minority stake, 7%, 10% stake in these companies, and it helps them out through in the early stages, a bit of mentoring. Sometimes they have office space and so on. So a real range from this sort of startup accelerator to a more of a traditional VC fund. So that's Telefonica and Verizon that are still doing this kind of venture investing, but very much the exceptions compared to the other operators. This sort of thing has mostly gone out of fashion. So just back to the points that I made earlier on. So operators, lots and lots of operators are looking at proximate businesses to support connectivity. So video being the obvious and most prominent example. Secondly, operators limiting number of new investments. So we see like Telstra going into healthcare or Orange going into banking. They're picking one or two different vertical markets, going in it very heavily, but not investing in other things. But then when we look at that compared to where the Malaysian operators are today, they are very much on the left-hand side, very much just doing connectivity, not going into some of these areas.
You don't have a choice. Over here, it's sinful to have drop calls. So, everybody does a drop call,
Well, it does seem, again, I don't know them very well, but looking at the emphasis of investment for this year, it seems to be all about network investments, increasing coverage and so on, which the other operators around the world are doing as well. It's not that that doesn't exist, it's just they also have this other emphasis of these kind of new service areas. Any?
Nowadays, drop call is also important.
So, I've had the example of the problem is if you're a telecoms operator, where you have a drop call, what do they need to do? How much is it going to cost them to make it so they have better coverage? So let's say it costs them $1 million. They could also invest that $1 million in call centres, or they could invest it in something else.
That's not the problem. Right? The problem is to pay. I'm not sure I should tell you. They have to pay heavily for all those rental sites.
Yeah.
People are making them, speak to the nose. The approval fees and all those. Of course you have drops, right? It's not difficult to just put up something, but the other thing that you need to put up this service, you need to pay for it to somebody else.
Yeah. But I think that kind of is the thing, because they've got a choice. They can make that investment or not, and so they have to. If you have a drop call, will you churn or not? And they have to work out. And then maybe they can spend $1 million. It's kind of a thought experiment. Do you spend $1 million on new base stations, getting better coverage, or do you spend $500,000 on having better call centres? So when you do have a problem and you phone them up, they answer the phone quicker. And it may be a better investment to spend that money on call centres than it is on network.
I offer them WhatsApp.
Sorry?
I offer them WhatsApp.
Well, the WhatsApp is that if the calls are dropping because the network connection's gone, WhatsApp is
Drop
dropping.
data.
Yeah. Well,
That's what the other conference was saying. Said today I don't have to announce, I ask you to switch on the phone because no one is talking.
yeah, that's true.
So drop call is no longer a problem because of people moving
Moving to data.
the
Yeah.
Or he speak for himself.
Well, no, just ask all of them.
No, for you know, but we know who we're doing.
But why do you see that the Malaysian operator they are not like going towards the?
Well, I think it's to do with well, I think it's
I think that's good. What the Malaysian
it's to do
operators
with
concentrating on network. I think that's good because when we talk about all these smart cities and you know where our smart cities are going to be? Places where they're smart homes. I'm sorry, but the thing is our focus is that it's not matching.
well, the the reason I think this is up, I mean, Telstra has lots of questions about its coverage as well, because Australia is a massive country, it's very difficult to cover, very expensive. So they have lots of holes in their network as well. They always have these issues.
There's only how many operators?
Three operators there.
How many million people?
20 million, something like that. Well, the reason though the reason I think it's happening elsewhere more than it is in Malaysia is this: that Telstra is facing declining revenues, Singtel's facing declining revenue. Markets have saturated.
Finding new.
So markets are saturated. Competition is mostly about price. Prices are starting to fall, so revenues are falling. So they need something else to make up the gap. Now that's particularly acute in excuse me. That's particularly acute in some countries. But Telstra is kind of a sort of typical example of what's happening. So if they want to tell their investors that their revenues are growing, they have to do something else. Now, that will happen to the Malaysian operators as well. I mean, it already is to Celcom last year. Telco Malaysia grew, 3%? It's reasonable growth. They're expecting a similar sort of number this year. But it's going to come, I'll forecast, at some point there's an inflection and revenues start to decline, and then Telco Malaysia and all of the others will have this pressure to do other stuff. Now, I would argue it's much easier to invest in new stuff where your revenues are still growing. It's much easier to go to your CFO and say, let's invest in a new IoT network while we're still growing, than it is to say, well, we're declining, let's invest in something a bit risky. So, I think it's easier in a way, it's easier for the Malaysian operators to invest now rather than waiting. But,
Don't you think the Malaysian mobile market is saturated now?
well, it does seem like I don't understand the Malaysian market.
Saturated, and yet Telco Malaysia wants to go convergent. Yeah, saturated. Don't know
But
that.
actually, if they are not investing, they are in trouble. They'll be too late, As
Yeah.
the thing is dropping,
Yeah.
and they take too long to decide to invest in something new,
Yeah.
it will be too late.
Yeah.
It becomes irrelevant.
Yeah, it becomes more difficult to do. The more the later you wait, and particularly if your revenues are falling quicker and quicker, then the more pressure you're going to come.
Based on this conversation, Tom, when you say Telstra, you have 1, 2, 3, and then Telco is the new one that they
Yeah.
And on the opposing side, you have like Telco Malaysia reinventing themselves as a digital company.
Yeah.
So, could you say something about that? Would it be better to do what Telstra did, or would it be better to do what TM is doing? Because you see, when you say TM, you see all those smart thing, but you don't really see anything there.
Yeah.
They're saying they're doing a digital company, but as an analyst, you don't see.
And I don't speak for many. I don't know Telco Malaysia. I don't know what there may be things going on that we're not aware of. But from an outsider looking in, doesn't seem to be much. So there's certainly aspiration, certainly interest in those areas, but it feels a bit like when you're writing an annual report, you have to say some stuff about new things. You have to be positive in some way, even if you're not sure quite what it is. And it feels a bit more like that, but I really don't know.
Thank you so much. I think we need to stop here. Tom has a flight to catch at 5:30. So Tom, welcome.